Welcome back to Wisdom and Exile Radio. This is the final episode of season 1 of Wisdom and Exile Radio. We're almost reached the end of Lama Jambataya's book, Wisdom and Exile, Buddhism and Modern Times. And it's the end of an era, episode 14, I think it is. And we've been here since, how long have we been doing this now? It's a long time. But if you stuck with us this long, well done. We're making it to the end of the book, so hopefully it's been useful. So we're on chapter. What's the number again? Chapter 9. Why is compassion? And we start. This is the third and final part of that chapter. We've covered equanimity. And we've covered loving kindness, which was in the last episode. And today we're going to cover compassion and joy, or sympathetic joy. And then we'll finish the book with the book's conclusion. So, without further ado, the section on compassion. Of course, compassion is one of the most important qualities in the Buddhist teachings. So Lama Jampa makes a couple of points about meditating on compassion here. I'll just mention a couple, and then I'll ask our learned colleagues for their views, Paul and Norin. So he says, Lama Jampa says in the book, he talks about compassion in terms of thinking about it in terms of what would it be to have experience someone else's experience, and in particular their suffering. So really putting yourself in their shoes, I suppose, and taking that perspective. And he talks a little bit about how compassion follows on from loving kindness. So you open up to others with a sort of warmth to their life and their experience. Through feeling this, through generating love. So in a way, compassion, he says, it's actually it's a question of moving from love to compassion is a question of degrees. The degree of open-heartedness, he says, it requires more of you. So if we start with you Paul, could you say a little bit about that, like the degree of the relationship between loving kindness and compassion, how you get from one to the other?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like you say, I think he says, isn't it, love in some ways a bit easier to meditate on because you're thinking about others' happiness, and thinking about suffering could be a bit heavier in a way. So it's good to start with love, and this idea of all beings have been our mother's limitless times, and just as with our current mother, we can generate real love, wish for them to have happiness, and the causes. And so meditation on compassion is a very similar approach, isn't it? We start with our present day mother, but this time think about how we don't want all the gratitude we have towards her, and therefore we don't want her to suffer or have the causes of suffering. So they're very similar, I think, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a good point. Norin, what's the difference between love and compassion? How are they different?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer. I was trying to think about instances of compassion that I could clearly say that's where I was experiencing compassion in my life, like hands down, no doubt about it, versus maybe how I would distinguish that from loving kindness. I'm happy to give like some super quick examples and maybe get some feedback on them, because the two things that cropped into my mind and I always think about were one when I was working as a cancer nurse on a pediatric cancer unit, and I came across a kid who had looked after once before, and his cancer was in remission. So he was basically on the track for recovery. He was like 13. and he'd lost his dad the previous year. And I thought he was on the mend, good to go, see you later, never saw him again. And then they called me to work on the pediatric unit. They asked me to come down and see this kid who'd just come out of surgery and help out. And it was the same kid, and he had just had an amputation. He just had his leg amputated from the hip down. And I wasn't expecting to go in and see him, so I had no way of preparing for it. And as soon as I made eye contact with him, he just woke up from his anesthesia. And I locked eyes with him, and he looked at me like he just realized his leg had been cut off, pretty dark. And it just kind of looked at me like a familiar face. And like, you know, like anyone in that situation, you have an overwhelming sense of compassion, like to the point where you just wish you could exchange places with that person. Their suffering is so horrible that you just wish that you could change places with them. And a similar thing happened to me when I hit a deer last year. It might sound silly or not, I don't know, but like I hit a deer when I was driving along, and it was paralyzed for a bit. I'm not sure if it was lame completely or not, but just the basic suffering that I saw, and that I, you know, part of the narrative was that I was part of, you know, I'd hit this deer with my car, was that I wish I could exchange places with, wish there was something I could do to alleviate your suffering. And it's not an intellectual thing, although we can approach it intellectually, I think. But it's just this very overwhelming sense, I think, of that, the analogy that I think Patrul Rinpoche uses is the mother without arms trying to save their child. This really strong emotion of wishing that we could just save others, that we could help them. And I'm not sure how that differs from loving kindness. Loving kindness seems a little bit not as intense, but compassion seems like a big fire we're setting underneath something to gain the impetus for our practice. And
yeah, no, that's very powerful words. That's really striking examples of compassion. I think that's exactly right. I mean, there is a formal difference between the two of them, right? It's the loving kindness is wanting them to be happy, and the compassion is wanting them to be free from their suffering. And something that Lama Jampa says in the book about that, how that is a difference of degree, actually, is that the suffering of others is hard to look at and hard to live with, whereas wanting them to be happy, feeling their loving kindness is easier, because of course it's easy to look at happiness, you know. It's easy to think about their happiness, think about what it would take for them to be happy. It's pleasant, everything's nice about it, there's nothing unpleasant about it. But yeah, the suffering, the compassion element is dealing with the unpleasant suffering element. And there's a, like when you're talking, Norin, about that kid, there's a painfulness, I think, in feeling compassion, because it's so hard, and that overwhelming feeling of wanting to do something but not being able to do anything is a painful feeling. Paul, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking in my own head, thinking of examples. I haven't got anything as striking as Paul's, but I think you're right. I mean, there's this element, isn't it? Wise compassion. It's the name of the chapter. I think you hit on it there, Aid, isn't it? It's like, you know, when you see people suffering, you know, one way people, you know, you may want to deal with it is just wishing the suffering to stop and go away. But then there is this element of, you know, wise compassion, is the wisdom of it is, well, what is the cause of people's suffering, our own or other people's suffering? And the answer is non-virtue. And to your point, is so one, we're often helpless even now to end their suffering, but really what we want for them is for them to practice virtue and avoid non-virtue so they don't suffer in the future. And to your point, it's apart from prayers and practice, you know, our ability to help people reorientate themselves to practice virtue and avoid non-virtue is so limited right now. So yeah, often, you see different people in different situations, but it's often, it comes back to all prayers, isn't it? Or you may recite some manis for them or whatever. And but yeah, you're probably right. It's harder thinking or contemplating and empathizing with suffering than love and happiness and joy, maybe.
Yeah, I got one little example, probably not as powerful as Norin's, but and while we're trying to sort of speak from the heart a bit, when Lama Jampa was last in Santa Monica in January 2020, he taught the 8 verses of mind training, which of course is, compassion is a very big part of if people don't know that teaching, compassion is a very important part of it. And he said then, he talks about this element of suffering. The suffering of others is something that is, the selfish mind naturally recoils from it and wants to avoid the sight of it. Just as a well, no, I won't get into that now. But yeah, the selfish mind wants to recoil from it and hide away from it. He said something like this, that he wants to be as far away from their suffering as possible. Get it out of my sight. I'm sure we kind of know that feeling. And he said, when you're trying to train the mind when you're trying to be compassionate, it's training. Like, you've got to be patient with yourself, and it's okay to fail a lot of the time, but sometimes, of course, I'm just paraphrasing here, and my memory of it is very imperfect, but, try a little bit. And so, I think just a few days after that, I was in Venice. Venice, there's a lot of homelessness in Venice, and you see people in such states of degradation, it's almost unimaginable. I mean, it's so shocking. And I just remember seeing this old lady. I don't know how old she was, but she looked old. But of course, homelessness and drug use ages you visibly. And she was in such a state of degradation; it was almost unbelievable. And she was trying to go into Whole Foods and get herself some food. And I just remember, like, trying to apply the teaching, and so I'm going to go and help her. But I couldn't do it. I totally failed because her plight was so extreme. I just couldn't bring myself to get into proximity to her. But one of the things that Lama Jampa said during that teaching was, like, their suffering is really, from the wisdom point of view, you're not really a separate self. Like, that's just a delusion. Like, their sufferings we're all connected to their sufferings, and ultimately they're not separate from our sufferings. So in a way, you're just looking at your own suffering, and to not do anything about it is just a state of ignorance.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's funny you raise that, because for some reason, I often think the same thing, because I cycle to the centre every day, pretty much. And so I pass through all these homeless encampments in Venice every day. And to your point, yeah, the degradation is quite staggering. But yeah, your power to do anything about it is so limited. And then often, like, this is a minor thing, but once I was just walking down Main Street past the subway, and some guys, homeless guys, said, "Oh, can you buy me some food?" I thought, "Oh, right, okay, yeah, I'll get you a sandwich." And I went in the subway, and he started ordering, and then he started ordering this biggest one, and then he said, "And I want this extra, and I want that extra, and I want that extra, and can you get me the biggest Coke?" And then the lady behind the counter said, "You shouldn't have done this. He comes in here every day, tries to get someone in, just uses them." Didn't know that. So I got him it, but it's like you're sort of thinking, you just doing, that's sort of non-virtuous behavior. I mean, it's a much silly example in ways, a minor one, but
I got a similar one.
Like yesterday, I was cycling to the centre, and there's this, another homeless guy, but obviously just mentally ill, a lot of them off meth and so on. And he's in the middle of the street, stopping the cars, And then this girl, who I think she lives around here, was running up the street to get away from him because she was so scared because the guy's off his rock and said something to her. So she's running scared with their dog away from him. And yeah, it's just it's like this whole world, which is right on your doorstep. You're part of it, but you're living in parallel universes in a way, and your ability to cross over is so limited. And then sometimes, and it comes to that point about wise compassion. You know, some people, isn't it, think it's compassionate to help them in these some ways, like external ways. And it's not necessarily saying that's bad, but it isn't necessarily going to help them, because it was, you know, the root of the suffering is in our own minds and our own behaviors. And
those are good examples. Like, it's funny because we all mentioned quite extreme examples. There's two things I wanted to say about that. Was one of them is it can be very easy to dismiss and let go of our compassion if we think, well, why is that person suffering? Well, it's their desire, their hatred, and their ignorance. And so we can say, well, you know, they're just like, to some degree, just kind of reaping the whirlwind of their previous actions. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be compassionate. And the other one is how ignorance is, it's easy to focus on the previous two, desire and hatred, because those are ugly things. Whereas ignorance is more of just the kind of mist that I think we all, you know, it's easy to say, well, I'm not feeling hatred to that person right now, whereas that person looks full of hate. Whereas I definitely am ignorant. You know, I'm ignorant of the defilements. I'm still believing in a self, and that's the source of my suffering. That's the source of their suffering. So there's more of a bridge to the defilements there. Like, you may see somebody who's suffering, have compassion towards them or a being, but sometimes it can be easy to push them away because you feel like their defilements are, you know, so unreachable.
Yeah, but I guess I was saying more that it's difficult on this, but it's a bit like the thing about when you see people suffering, and to your point, it's not therefore you don't want to run away, but it's like if you're engaged with it, I don't know, it just feels like, you know, there's something so profound about the Dharma and Buddhism and the power of practice. But that's it. But, you know, so you invoke prayers, isn't it, for them, and you know, whoever deity we practices, but really think of it, you really do want them to be free from suffering, and you really can't really help them properly now, but the Buddhas can, and the power of the deity can touch them in some way.
So all I wanted to say was, like, there's a line in this part on compassion about subsequently you should meditate on compassion to phenomena.
Yeah, well, that's we can get into that. So there's Dhammacampa talks about three ways of meditating on compassion. One is there's the progressively more subtle, that you begin with just meditating on ordinary compassion to other sentient beings as they appear to be, you know, just other. and then he talks to something which you've just touched on, which is more subtly, you think about them as being subject to what we call defilements or disturbing emotions, which is, as you said, desire, hatred, and ignorance, and those being the causes of their suffering. So in a way, them being the authors of their own suffering. But that nevertheless, as you said, that's not a reason to not have compassion. You still have compassion for them, even though in a way they're the authors of, as we all are, the authors of our own suffering and misfortunes. And then the third one is the most subtle, which is what does he call it? Meditating on non-conceptual compassion, I think, was it?
Without referential objects,
yeah.
And what
which is the root of nescience, isn't it? Been the root of all ignorance and the disturbing emotions and the rest. So wishing them
nescience meaning, because I have to look that one up sometimes.
Oh, ignorance about the true nature of reality or our own mind.
That's right, lack of awareness, right? So, nescience. Yeah.
So just to finish on compassion, well, this is probably the last point on compassion because we do need to move on, but he does make, which you've already touched on. He does make a point about it's not seeing humans as intrinsically good. There are bad. This is how I read it. There are bad people in a way. You can say that, you know. And this also touches on the point of, to an extent, everyone's suffering is a consequence of decisions or defilements that they made in the past. But so you don't only have compassion for the innocent, and that is where, like, you know, it's very, in a way, it's probably easier to have compassion for, like, your example, Norin, of a child who has a terrible illness, and, you know, and very severe treatments are required, like amputation, because a child seems innocent. But someone who is, say, older and who's led a very bad life, and, you know, you can sort of say there's a sort of poetic justice maybe if they come to suffer. But compassion, the kind of compassion we're talking about, wise compassion, doesn't actually discriminate the innocent from the guilty. Everyone is sort of blameless in a way. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the main things I take from Four Limitless Meditations, is that notion of everyone being your mother, isn't it? And it's a sort of skillful means teaching. There's something really, really powerful about that. So whenever, you know, we catch ourselves falling into that, isn't it? You know, it may be a bad person, and therefore it may be easy to think, you know, they got their comeuppance, whatever. But always remembering how everyone's been your mother, yeah, it really softens that in some way. It sort of dissolves, you know, all these sort of negative emotions in some way, sort of softens our mind in a way. Just that recognition they've been our mother limitless times. Because you could say, obviously, they've probably been our enemy limitless times as well, or they've killed us at limitless times. Obviously, it's not very helpful to meditate on that. Meditating, they have been our mother limitless times and done all this stuff for us, even though I don't remember. So we've got this gratitude for them. I don't know, it's something just so very powerful about that.
All right. Next part of the book is sympathetic joy. So joy is, I think, in a way, the antidote, or the opposite, to jealousy and envy, which are, of course, very limited, constrained states of mind, narrow states of mind that keep us bound to our own suffering. And he makes the point that, in a way, jealousy and envy look at the world and look at the happiness in the world as a zero-sum game, as in, whoever gets something good, I feel bad because I don't get it, you know. But there's a sort of delusion in that, because the world isn't a zero-sum game. There's, you know, if someone gets something good, and Shantideva, I remember Shantideva makes that point in the Bodhicharyavatara. He says something like, you know, when someone gives something to someone else, and you feel like, I wish I hadn't got that, like, I didn't get it, you know, it doesn't make any difference to you. Like, you weren't going to get it anyway. You know, if that person hadn't given it, they just would have kept it, you know. But still, we managed to sort of make it all about us. So two people who you might be completely unrelated to, and then, you know, one person is virtuously giving their stuff away to the other person, and you're there on the outside going, I disapprove of this. I'm not involved. I should be the recipient of everything. So anyway, that's
yeah, it's like everything in our culture from the moment we're born is set us up to defy that very concept, in so much as you've got to hold on to what you've got. You've got to be competitive, you know, in whatever, like, you know, sports, education, career, everything, you know, capitalist society we live in. It's all about, well, you've got to hold on to what you've got. If somebody else got something unfairly, then, you know, like, fight to get that back. All of these things, we never celebrate the fact that, yeah, somebody else is just doing well. And if we do, it's almost seen as like you're a little bit behind the curve somewhat. You know, you probably need to get yourself up to speed.
It does feel like this, our society is increasingly, you know, sort of resentment sort of culture, isn't it? And I find this one such a great antidote, isn't it? Because often you find yourself, you know, getting some sort of resentment, like, say, if someone gets something good. But this one is, like, explains, isn't it? Like, it's like, so if someone's really rich, you want them to be richer. You know, if someone's really good looking, famous, beautiful, you want them more beauty, more fame, great. You know, let's say, so celebrating everyone and not only wanting them not to have it, but actually wanting them to have more of good things. Because also it's a recognition, well, why should we be resentful? It's they've obviously done a lot of good shit in the past, and they're reaping the benefit of that. So that's great. And they should hope they do more of it so they get even more positive results. There's real antidote, I think, to a lot of what's going on nowadays. I mean, he discusses, wasn't it? But he compares this joy to this notion of people claiming fairness. You know, invoking fairness, usually to say some group should get more of stuff. But then he says it warns us about, you know, what's the real motive behind it? Is it really altruistic, or you just want this group to get stuff? Or is it also driven by rage and resentment against this other group that have that stuff?
Yeah. I live in Calabasas, which is the home, or has been the home, not where I live, obviously. I live in the plebeian quarter, but you know, it's the home to people like Justin Bieber and the Kardashians, apparently. And I live opposite this incredibly wealthy gated community, and the houses there, you know, they're like worth, you know, tens of millions. And you see them, and so you see them driving out of their gated community in their Ferraris and whatnot. And yeah, you do. You know, I often remember this teaching that you're supposed to think, may you have even greater car, the latest Ferrari. You know, even bigger house, more rooms, better pool,
higher gates.
Go on.
Higher gates, taller gates.
And it's funny, it makes you laugh, because, you know, it's like, it seems almost ridiculous, but
it's funny that you say it makes you laugh, because Lama always says you're supposed to have a sense of humor about all of these things. When they get too serious, it's like, you know, you're a little bit off track, because you can like totally, you know, go down a rabbit hole with it.
It definitely, witnessing these people's lives from the outside, it definitely creates such a flurry of contradicting thoughts in my mind. You know, on the one hand, I've got this natural resentment and anger, and then it quickly sort of, you know, then you start to justify your feelings of resentment by bringing in politics. You know, oh well, if we had a more politically just system, then, you know, poor people wouldn't be poor. And then I remember the Dharma maybe, and it'd be like, oh no, you know, may you have more. And so I'm just in this state of sort of like, you know, complete, you know.
The thing is that, isn't it about the politics side, isn't it? It's so easy to fall into this belief, which is so dominant in our society, that it is possible to rearrange the external world and you can create this perfect, fair society. But from a Dharma point of view, you know, it's just never going to happen. Not unless, you know, you root out the causes of suffering and so on. Then, you know, even if, because like your example of the guy with his Ferrari and his, you know, $100 million house, it doesn't mean, doesn't even mean they're that happy.
Yeah.
And then have they got the Dharma? You know, what are they doing with their life?
Absolutely. I think that's a good way to look at it. Yeah, you know, because you can go up into the hills and you look down on this community and you can see the wealth, you know, and I sometimes do think that, like, I think, well, what's really going on inside those houses? There's probably some quite serious suffering, and definitely a lot of I'm sure there's a lot of envy and competitiveness. Like, they're not looking down on us and thinking, wow, you know, I'm doing so much better than them. They're looking at their neighbors who might have a slightly bigger pool and thinking, like, that bastard, like, if only I had that pool. Right, so I think we finished the 4 immeasurables, and Namajampa just concludes the chapter by framing them in terms of their causes of bodhicitta, or bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment in Buddhism, which is really the essence of the Mahayana. And he even distinguishes within the Mahayana the way of practicing the 6 perfections. He says, you know, giving, ethics, patience, energy, and wisdom, and the method of practicing the Vajrayana. Does anyone want to summarize what is the Vajrayana?
Oh, you could probably do it best. Think quick and succinctly.
Well, I mean, Namajampa doesn't say much about it, does he, to be fair? So I guess it's more, you know, the teachings on the 4 limitless meditations are part of the common Mahayana, or common great vehicle teachings, which anyone can, in a way, can practice. The Vajrayana, they're all the Tibetan traditions. The Vajrayana teachings, which are taught in the Buddhist tantras, are like the most esoteric teachings and most powerful teachings in terms of how to meditate and transform our experience in our life. And so in a way, I think Lama Jumpa felt he had to mention it because it's so core to anyone that practices any of the 4 Tibetan traditions. It's the way in which we can ultimately accelerate our bodhicitta, our wish to achieve Buddhahood for benefit of others. Vajrayana is sort of the most powerful techniques to do that. So I think it seemed like a reference to that, but without going into any detail.
Yeah, I always remember that saying that, like, I don't know if it was true or if there's even a scriptural reference for it, but somebody said when I was first getting into Buddhism, like, you have to be pretty messed up to get into Vajrayana in the first place. And I was like, what do you mean? It's like, well, if you don't know you're sick, then the medicine isn't going to work for you. So to some degree, you have to realize that you're really in trouble for you to even then like seek out some medicine. Because a lot of people are like, well, no, I'm all right. I'm doing fine. It's okay. Bobbing along. Whereas a lot of people who get into, or, you know, take refuge, get into Vajrayana, because it wasn't part of our culture growing up in the West, then there was a trigger. There was a big, you know, focal event oftentimes that sparked it. Not for everyone, but, and oftentimes that was like, oh my, it's like this harsh awareness, the shock, the electric jolt to the system of like, this isn't going to work for me. I need to do something radically different. I am sick. I do have all these problems. What conventional means aren't going to help me. And so I need to seek some pretty strong medicine. And the Vajrayana is it for some people. But you have to know that you're messed up in the first place to really seek out the medicine.
In a way, that's been a theme of the entire book, really, or certainly large parts of it, that the problems, whatever problems we encounter within our life, whether internal or external, there's a strong tendency to blame, to look outside of ourselves for a solution, and it's the understanding that there isn't really any lasting solution outside of ourselves. You have to go inside. Is, I think, the beginning of the Dharma, and I think we've probably mentioned that a few times over the course of the book. But anyway, here we are at chapter 10. Very, very short chapter, so we'll just cover it now by way of concluding. Chapter 10, beginnings, and it's almost like an afterword on the book. So, Norin, do you want to give a quick summary of what's said here?
Yeah, it just feels like kind of mirroring back to the beginning here, where Lama's reflecting on when he first encountered Sakya Zen. You know, when he was a young man, and the same, it feels like there's kind of a relative and an ultimate interpretation to this chapter in terms of, well, we still have the Dharma, so here we are. What do? We go back to the beginnings, we practice. But the deeper kind of meaning from this chapter to me is that there's a constant cycle of, like, if you're on the path to enlightenment, if you've taken refuge and you're applying bodhicitta, it's not like when we talk about achieving Buddhahood, but that's a very lofty goal. There's a constant cycle of improvement for us all, and we cycle back to beginnings. Do you remember there was somebody we all know, Gary, and he said to me, like, he'd been practicing for so many years, like 10, 20 years, and he had to talk to the Lama, and he said he just started really taking death and impermanence to heart after all that time. And he's like, well, now you're practicing, and it feels like that. It's like you can be practicing for 10 or 20 years, and then you cycle back to the beginning, and it's like, oh yeah, now there's a basic component here that was just as true then, and I've got to go back to and reground myself with.
Yeah, very, very good. Paul, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. It's so true, isn't it? It's more like, it almost feels like the more you practice, the more you realize how far you've got to go.
Yeah.
It just gets like, oh. But anyway, on this last chapter, I think there's another thread in there. I mean, it's really interesting round off to the book, but there's a thread that goes back to the beginning of the book and his early reflection, and he talks about he's reflecting on his own journey in dependent origination from a child, awakening his interest in Dharma and how he connected and got to where he is today. And then there's an interesting point about how reflecting on just how new Buddhism is to the West, you know, and it really is sort of minutes rather than years, sort of, as it were, sort of just gives a real sense of it really is very early days. And I think it says that while there are major challenges, there is still real opportunity. I think one of the biggest challenges he reflects on is the hardening to religion in modern culture, and I think that really is, yeah, for me anyway. This whole book, in a way, has been really one of the biggest impacts it's had on me. Is just really trying to sift through, you know, modern culture and modern day sentimentality and modern day popular views on things, and trying to unpick that from what real compassion and love is, this sort of limitless love and compassion, I guess we just wrapped up on, and just how different they are, but on the surface can seem so similar. You know, these calls for justice can seem so compassionate and nice, but when you really dig in, it's often the real raw emotion, disturbing emotion behind it is often rage and resentment against some group. And I don't know, the whole book, it just bangs on that in different ways, and sort of initially I found it, you know, really, really remarkable book in that sense.
Yeah. Just on this chapter, I think it has a sort of illusory quality that you know that is his way of ending the book. Like, you know, like it reminds me of, again, going back to the 8 verses of mind training. You know, the last verse of that is pointing to the fact that all of these practices are just an illusion, and you should never let them be corrupted by thinking that, you know, I'm really practicing the Dharma, I'm really developing compassion. All these things are an illusion, because, like, you know, the way he talks about standing in the Fairmont, at the window of the Fairmont Hotel, and looking out to the Pacific Ocean, and it just has a sort of and then recalling the past, you know, and it has a sort of illusory quality to it, I think. And it reminds me actually of, in the biography of Gyatso Ningpo, who's this great sort of 17th century Buddhist master. So, you know, 400 years ago, whatever. In his biography, he ends it by talking about sitting just quietly and drinking a cup of tea out of a white porcelain cup. And that also has this illusory quality, a timeless quality, where it's like, although he's depicting a specific scene and being in a specific place at a specific time, he's somehow communicating an illusoriness of it. Like, it's like a dream. It's not really, none of it's really real, and yet we see it. So I just thought there was a connection there, you know, the bringing in the wisdom element again. You know, none of the history. We've talked about the history of the West, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the science and politics, you know, and yet, you know, none of it is. It's all a bit of a dream, isn't it? You know, it's all a bit unreal, and we should, you know, I think he's just sort of calling that to mind as well, which is a, you know, interesting, great way, perfect way to end the book, really.
Yeah, so that's very profound. Yeah, important point. Like, from the beginning to the end, how different was Lama Jampa's journey? You know, he obviously still had enough insight at that point when he was a young man to connect with Psychiatry Zen and note that Christmas Humphreys was a little bit wacky. All of these things, you know, I mean, he would note the same things, I'm sure, now. There's like you said, there's a timelessness to it all that's very profound. And it feels like when you kind of, it's underlying everything. not something that needs to be fabricated. It was there then, it's there now. And really all we need to kind of see is trust in it to some extent.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we finished Wisdom in Exile, Buddhism and Modern Times. Unless there's any further.
We have finished.
Great.
And what next, Adrian? What next?
Yeah, in case anyone wonders what we're doing, we're just touching the book to our heads as a mark of respect, really, because it is a Dharma, it's a true Dharma text, and we always treat those very respectfully. So yeah, so we're going to take a little break. That's the end of season 1. Hope you enjoyed it. We do plan to be back for season 2 in the future, but we're going to take a little break. So we'll be back in the summer. Not exactly sure when, but we do plan to be back with some upgrades and updates. We're going to download the latest upgrades and everything, patches and all that. So if you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with us and putting up with us. And thanks for all of your comments and everything. You know, we really appreciate it. And we've had so much support, you know, and emails and stuff. And every time we get one, it's been like, you know, it's really great. It's kept us going, actually, you know, the comments and emails that we've had. So thanks for that. And I don't know, I think we should dedicate the merit. What about you?
Sounds good. Good way to finish. Yeah, dedicate the merit.
Could you lead that, Paul?
Sure. By this merit, may all beings gain omniscience and defeat all the enemies that harm them. May thus we liberate from this world, which is like a notion of birth, sickness, old age, and death. Sonam de tende zipane, donene bejanam banchane, chikana chupala chupa, sibeshore jua jua show.